Every year, the freshmen at Washington University are assigned a book to read over the summer before they arrive on our shores. I used to try my best to read those along with them because it led to some great conversations. One of those books, probably the last one I had a chance to read, was written by a scientist named Alan Lightman. His best-selling novel was Einstein's Dreams. The connection with this morning's gospel about the struggle of faith for the Apostle Thomas, a struggle that literally ended up identifying Thomas with the word doubting, perhaps into perpetuity, is not so much, the connection is not so much with that book as it is with that professor. He is someone I'd be honored to meet. Professor Alan Lightman, a scientist. He says he is not a believer in God, but he wishes he were. You and I can discuss many things using religion and science, including the basics of Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism and Islam and Christianity, and the findings of scientists like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Einstein, and Hawkins. But to that mix, we must add our own personal experiences, and we must add our ponderings, especially as we consider subjects like the night sky, like the end of life. Ah, death. Death is the gradual diminishment of consciousness. According to science, a human person, is made up of about 7,000 trillion atoms. 7,000 trillion atoms. You are, and so is the person next to you right now. 7,000 trillion atoms. The totality of our tissues and muscles and organs is composed of those atoms. And according to the common scientific view, there is nothing else. We are simply assemblages of atoms. That's not a small thing, but it's simply that. And when we die, this special assemblage dissembles. This professor, this scientist, holds to that position himself, that there is nothing else but those atoms. Until he starts to think about his deceased mom and dad, his loving father, his mother, who he would smile and talk about as totally dancing the bossa nova in front of him. He doesn't believe he will see them in the afterlife. He wonders about his own death as well. The professor writes that after thinking about this for a while, or whenever it comes up in him again, he says, I just have to take a long walk. I just have to take a long walk. This makes that subject quite poignant, I think. For me, for many of us, I suspect here this morning, when those 7,000 trillion atoms are committed to your 7,000 trillion atoms, something of eternity is opened up. When you spend time with that assemblage of atoms and you get to know that person and you suffer for them and you sacrifice for them and you behold them and you make love with them and you forgive them, something of eternity is experienced, something timeless in time, something you might call Christ. Something seems to open up in those spaces between all those atoms that is you, that perhaps you could even describe as your soul. There is that 7,000 trillion atoms and more to you and to that person sitting next to you right now, whom you may not even know. Something eternal, right? Maybe. Something beyond time that we can get lost in, that makes heaven something I can believe in. Ah, death. Ah, night sky. I can't help but remember back to when I was a freshman in college, when I read in the newspaper about some discovery of the very first black hole out there in space. My imagination went crazy, and stretching between me as an 18-year-old, first getting excited about this first black hole posited, until just a couple of weeks ago, when someone for the very first time in all of human history showed us a black hole, a photograph of one of those black holes from 18 to 68. Now, dang, that's truly exciting to me. Because you see, I fancy myself a budding astrophysicist. Right? But I do find, and I'm lucky enough to know many great scientists across the street, I do find that any honest scientist will tell you that explanations that work today may not work tomorrow. Science doesn't deal in certainty so much as in the search for certainties, which makes science more similar to religion than perhaps many scientists would like to admit. Some scientific principles endorse absolutism, those principles that people believe but cannot prove. They believe them, we work off of them, but we can't prove them by any law of science. Like, for example, the concept of yourself or your soul, which many scientists would say is an illusion. Where this scientist, Alan Lightman, where he, this professor, and I agree, begins in that moment, he describes in these words. Several years ago, I was on a motorboat in the Atlantic Ocean heading to an island. I cut off the boat's engines and, lying back, looked up at the night sky, feeling at one with the universe. After a few minutes, he says, my world had dissolved. My world had dissolved in that star-littered sky. The boat disappeared. My body disappeared. And I found myself falling into infinity. I felt emerging with something far larger than myself. That scientist and I believe, both of us believe, in a personal, transcendent experience. We have had them, he and I. I suspect we all have. And we would both agree with something William James wrote when he wrote in these words, and I quote, having once felt the presence of God's Spirit, I have never lost it again for long. Lightman calls this experience the most powerful evidence we have for a spiritual world. It's an immediate feeling of some unseen order or truth in the world. It's an immediate feeling of some unseen order or truth in the world. His experience, his words to describe that experience resonated within me, and they reminded me of Vincent van Gogh's painting, The Starry Night. I'm sure you've seen it. You've seen pictures of it for sure. Those whirling stars moving and surrounded by almost something like an exaggerated halo around each of those stars, almost moving across the sky, so evocative. Interestingly, Van Gogh, who also rejected organized religion, once wrote in a letter to his brother, said these words, "I have a tremendous need for religion, so I go outside at night to paint the stars." I can't, and I'm haunted by the words of that scientist professor. I felt myself merging with something far larger than myself, that from a real astrophysicist. When doubting Thomas experienced the same moment of transcendence, his experience gave way to a cry, "My Lord and my God." Perhaps one of the greatest professions of faith in human history, just 5 words, in a moment of absolute transcendence, "My Lord and my God." Raised up he was in just those 5 words, "My Lord and my God." My mom taught us when we were kids, my brother and I, that when the priest raised the host after the consecration, she said, "You should think those 5 words, Gary. You should think, looking at the host transformed into presence, 'My Lord and my God.'" And so I have, and so I do. I want to be someone who lives in this universe, and I want to be someone who lives inside every friendship, going around crying out, "My Lord and my God." Perhaps you are like that professor. Perhaps you define yourself as not a believer, but as someone who wishes you were. Perhaps you have made the leap and clearly trust that God is, mystery is, love is. Wherever you are on that fluid continuum, I'm really glad you're here. You belong here. It means the world to me to stand with you here and join hands with you here and share with you that fundamental experience of transcendence that we stumble upon here and there along the way. And I mean way with a capital W. Because there's one thing about which we all need to be clear together, that the way underneath those night skies, the way along which we ponder the realities of death, the way is a way of self-emptying, self-giving love. That is our faith. That is the faith of our church.